She was erased from the guest list, but her billionaire husband made them regret it. You're requesting my wife's departure. Just as the opulent dining room went quiet, Jordan's words sliced through it like a razor. Story lovers, welcome. From where are you watching today? Tell us about your city in the comments section below. Do you believe this was a simple miscommunication or something much more intentional? In today's tale, a stunning professor with brown complexion enters a birthday dinner, is humiliated, and is seated elsewhere. However, the appearance of a limited edition Tesla 5 minutes later destroys all sense of authority in the space. Who is the restaurant's owner? What made them target her? And what happens when corporate justice and quiet dignity collide? You won't want to miss the powerful reckoning that this story builds to, so stay tuned. Remember to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any of our most recent real-life tales of honor, failure, and salvation. Stay to the very end and let us know where you're watching from. It was more than just a seat. They should never have crossed that line. With its golden embossed letters gleaming in the gentle morning light, the ivory envelope on the edge of her kitchen counter caught Alina Moore's attention as if it had something to prove. She had never received an invitation like that before. Throughout her career, she had been honored with honorary panels, lecture tours, and academic conferences. This one, however, was unique. It was exclusive, social, and gilded in a way that only the very wealthy could afford. This was no ordinary birthday celebration. Madison Langford, the daughter of hedge fund tycoons Cynthia and Richard Langford, who have partnered with her husband Jordan in multiple real estate endeavors, was celebrating her 6th birthday. The event took place in the city's most sought-after restaurant, Vivre Blanc, where wait lists for reservations were longer than those for some Ivy League admissions, and where the menu solely included status symbols rather than prices. Jordan, always. Over dinner 2 weeks prior, the party had been lightly mentioned by the silent player in the world of luxury. They wanted us to come. In between mouthfuls of market greens and fish, he answered, "Yes, for both of us." Alina's eyebrow had gone up. "Both, this is merely a formality." He winked and said, "You'll enjoy it," as though answering yes was as easy as turning up. Alina, however, was not a fan of formality, not the kind that was dripping with silent judgments and codes. She didn't learn which course to use with which fork as a child, and she didn't want to act. But something constricted in her chest as she took another look at the invitation. She didn't feel anxious. She knew how frequently skin tone was surveyed before credentials in such settings. She nevertheless made the decision to go, to take up space, not to entertain or win people over. It would be some time before Jordan arrived. Alina didn't see the need to wait because he had appointments all day. On her terms, she would leave early. She wore a flowing white slip dress that hugged her curves carelessly, with little jewelry, no luxury handbag, no eye-catching shoes, just grace and purpose. Her hair was brushed back in a low bun, a cascade of delicate curls. Her presence would be self-evident. Just after 3, the Uber arrived at Vivre Blanc's elegant entrance. The restaurant appeared to be a temple of contemporary privilege, as the midday sun reflected off its glass and chrome front. Her door was opened by a pressed, charcoal-uniformed valet, whose eyes flickered momentarily as he registered her. Not in an antagonistic manner, but rather in that default scan that determined a person's suitability. Nevertheless, she went out with a high chin and deliberate, unconcerned steps. The interior was just as opulent as the stories said. Under her sandals, the marble floors shone like mirrors, and a huge chandelier that looked like a frozen firework hung from the ceiling, bathing the already well-curated crowd in warm, flattering light, subtle yet powerful. The aroma of chilled champagne and truffle oil wafted across the air, A young blonde with a tight bun and an even tighter smile stood at the hostess podium. Amber was written on her name tag. Alina came over with a courteous grin. "Greetings for the afternoon. Madison Langford's birthday is being celebrated. Alina Moore. I think my name ought to be on the guest list." Amber nodded ostentatiously and leafed through a feather-bound reservation book that exuded tradition, even though the entire space was set up for Instagram. She glanced at the pages twice, then stopped. She raised her head. "I apologize, but that name doesn't appear to have a reservation." Alina's smile remained unwavering. "It ought to be present. Jordan Moore, my spouse, personally attested to it. The Langfords extended an invitation to us. He even made reservations for a particular table 3 near the window of the garden." The small tightening of Amber's mouth was the type of micro-expression that Alina had seen countless times before, stuck between perception and protocol. She turned back after leaning in to whisper to another hostess, "Could you please wait a minute? I will ask our management to help you," as if she were invisible. The discussion and gentle music surrounding her carried on as Alina moved to the side. She didn't take offense, not quite yet, but she was making notes in her head. After 5 minutes, there were 10. She saw the arrival of guests, the majority of the white ones. They all wore clothing that suggested easy money. Without uncertainty, a woman wearing red Louboutins was ushered in. After a single nod to the personnel, a man dressed in linen was shown to a private lounge. Then a tall woman in an emerald silk dress came in like a satin storm from the other side of the room. She swept toward the hostess's stand, confident, tanned, and blonde. Amber stood up. "Greetings, Ms. Langley. Your favorite table is here. Are you ready? Table 3. Alina felt her heart pound. Her gaze shifted to the hostess. "Excuse me," she responded evenly, "but my husband had set aside that table for me." Amber's expression became unreadable when she blinked. "I apologize." "Ma'am, a mix-up must have occurred. Miss Langley frequently visits this place. That for weeks the table has been set aside for her." Alina glanced at her, then at the manager, a man in his 40s wearing a custom-fit navy suit and with his hair slicked back, who had just approached from behind the hostess. Gareth Simmons was written on his name tag. He looked at Alina for a moment too long, his eyes analyzing rather than patronizing, as if she were an unanticipated intrusion in his usually orderly world. "I apologize, but the table isn't available anymore," Gareth remarked, half smiling. "You can be seated close to the kitchen. There, it's quieter." Like a razor, Alina's spine straightened. When she did speak, it was steel-lined and gentle. "While someone else occupies the table that was set aside for me, you're offering me the kitchen." Gareth gave a shrug. "We make every effort to accommodate our visitors. But occasionally we make mistakes." The inference was not subtle. She was the muddle in his world. She took another look around the lobby. Jordan was nowhere to be seen. There are no pals in sight, not in anger, but in self-control. Her hands clenched at her sides. She was a visitor at a facility that her husband had helped construct, but the system was treating her as an error. The faint purr of an electric engine reverberated outside the restaurant, subtle, elegant, and unlike any automobile the valet had handled that day. These was just as she was about to reply, and as Gareth nodded to security with the nonchalant arrogance of a man who believed he could handle circumstances like these. The air in Vivre Blanc started to change as the doors opened once more and everyone's heads turned. The man who had just exited the limited edition Tesla, parked at the curb, was revealed by the Vivre Blanc's front doors, which had opened with mechanical perfection just as the sound of the electric engine had just subsided. However, he didn't enter with a sense of entitlement or showmanship. Jordan Moore, on the other hand, strode with the deliberate control of a man who felt authority rather than displaying it. His attire differed from that of the ostentatious elite who cling to brands like armor. Rather, he wore a suit that was charcoal grey and so well cut that it conveyed riches without ever having to be shouted. Under the ambient chandelier light, his skin shone bronze, and his presence seemed to fill the room before his speech ever did. That was Jordan's problem. He didn't have to make an announcement. For him, the room always did it. However, he turned to face Alina, who was standing close to the exit. She clenched her teeth and folded her arms. His expression changed in some way. There was only a slight narrowing of the eyes. There was a slight jaw flex, but it was sufficient. He moved quickly and deliberately across the foyer, his gaze solely on her, as though the rest of the glistening room had vanished. All this time, you've been standing here. His voice was quiet, yet tense, as he inquired. Alina remained silent. She didn't have to. The response lingered between them, as evident as the uneasiness that rippled through the guests, who now observed the encounter with circumspect interest. She cocked her head in the direction of the hostess stand. There was no reservation, they said. Someone else was given the table. Jordan turned slowly, methodically, as if he were a guy about to demolish a well-made object. He looked at Gareth Simmons, who had stepped back as though he could blend in with the background somehow. You gave the table away. Reserved is the wife. Jordan didn't speak loudly. It was not necessary. It carried the burden of silent domination and expectation. People stopped in mid-sentence because of it. With a reflexive smile, Gareth cleared his throat. Mr. Moore, there appears to have been a miscommunication. Well, we were unaware of this. Your wife was the guest. The silent confession buried in that gap was there. This visitor, the woman you believed was out of place. Alina observed the scene with an odd disinterest, as though she were witnessing a theatrical production that she had seen practiced too often. The stakes were different today. Jordan Moore was not entirely known in the room. Although most people thought he was a wealthy investor, they were unaware that he was the main financier of Vivre Blanc, holding a silent 58% stake. In order to see how people behaved while they were unaware, he had decided to be invisible during procedures. They were being observed, Jordan repeated, as though he could taste the ridiculousness on his tongue. You didn't realize this was my wife. And tell me, would her reservation have miraculously returned if she hadn't been my wife? Gareth opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The hostess, Amber, glanced down at her hands. The visitors in the vicinity moved around in their chairs, uncertain. In an attempt to restore authority that had long since vanished, Gareth suggested that it was just a misunderstanding, even if they were witnessing a social faux pas or the start of something more serious. A valued guest made a last-minute request. Which guest? Jordan inquired. The question was a blade, but he already knew the answer. Gareth paused. Langley, Ms. Veronica Langley, Alina muttered. Likewise. I was treated like housework by a woman who had spoken on 3 diversity panels this year. Jordan didn't look at her, but his mouth moved. Instead, he took a stride forward in the direction of Gareth, who reflexively took a half-step back. Jordan's voice was stern now as he stated, You gave away my wife's reserved table to a woman who walked in without a reservation, simply because she looked like your version of a VIP. Then, as if my wife was fortunate to be allowed inside at all, you offered her a seat by the kitchen. Like a fog, silence enveloped them. Even the pianist had lowered his tune to a careful, weak melody. The champagne shimmer and decadence had left the restaurant's atmosphere. When class and colour clashed, it had become brittle and unpleasant, as though everyone had suddenly realized how brittle civility is. Gareth made another attempt, his forehead moist and his smile now rigid. "Of course, if we had known Mr. Moore," Jordan interrupted, "you didn't need to know. All you had to do was abide by the reservation, the name, the person in front of them, of you." Jordan turned to the room for the first time since he had arrived. He didn't speak louder. He didn't beat the ground. Nevertheless, everyone leaned in anyway. He explained, "And that's precisely why I remained in the background. I've seen the patterns and heard the whispers to get a sense of how this place really works. But you proved it to me today. Because my wife didn't arrive wearing sequins or European haughtiness, you assumed she didn't belong. You buried her name behind your prejudice after making a decision." With a crystal flute in her hand, Veronica Langley, who was now sitting at table 3, raised her chin and gave a smirk that hardly concealed her uneasiness. She forced a laugh by saying, "This is getting dramatic," loud enough to be heard. "We can all act like grown-ups about this, I'm sure." Jordan avoided eye contact with her. He continued to gaze at Gareth, who appeared to be losing his mind by the moment. Jordan said evenly, "Jordan Elijah Moore is my name. Not only is she my wife, but she is also Dr. Alina Moore, a tenured professor at Westbridge University, a published scholar, and the only person in this room who doesn't need to prove she is a woman. I am the establishment's largest shareholder. Belongs." He then turned to face Alina and extended his hand in unity rather than chivalry. She accepted it. Slowly, consciously. Behind them, Gareth stumbled over something, but it was already past. The damage was done, and Alina didn't grin as they made their way toward the middle of the room and the table that had been taken from her. She refrained from glaring. As they passed Veronica, who was staring down at her drink with the sparkle in her voice now less bright than the ice melting in her glass, she didn't even bat an eye. No one in that room would ever forget the sound of the truth beginning to reverberate after initial impressions had been deceiving. As Jordan and Alina walked across the dining floor, the low hum of ambient jazz and the clink of crystal stemware returned. But it was merely background noise. Every eye in the diner was tethered behind the sound. The velvet silence that had engulfed Vivre Blanc in its wake had not broken as they walked. Only it had moved. Now there was the quiet of self-control, of hushed verdicts and sidelong looks, of individuals feigning to drink from their drinks as their gazes followed the couple like a drone. As stated in the reservation, the third table, Alina's table, was situated beside the garden window. Nothing about the moment felt calm, even if the glass behind it framed the restaurant's wisteria-covered courtyard like a carefully manicured painting. Unwilling to leave her throne, Veronica Langley continued to sit like a queen at the table. She did not get up, not even blinking. She just crossed her legs and swirled her drink as if she still owned the place. Jordan's hand never left Alina's as he came to a stop just short of the table. He responded coolly, "I think you're sitting in the wrong seat." "Miss Langley." Slowly, Veronica looked up, her smirk unaltered, but her speech now had a purposeful innocence to it. "Oh, I didn't realize this table was such a thorn in the side. First come, first served, I thought." After taking a sip of her drink, she continued, "But if it means that much to her—" Alina interrupted abruptly. "It was a principled issue. But to you, it's always been entitlement cloaked in convenience." She spoke without shaking. It was crisp, measured, and sliced. Veronica's shield of porcelain politeness was slapped by every syllable. A couple of people at the table winced. An elderly man wearing a high-end scarf swiveled around in his seat to observe. Near the bar, a younger pair looked at each other with wide eyes. With a breathy giggle, Veronica rose slowly, as though it were a gift to the room. "Well, I guess we're all finding our place today, aren't we?" she asked. Stroking the front of her dress as if it had been ruined by closeness, Jordan remained silent. He just moved out of the way, holding the chair for Alina, who sat down silently. By that time, Gareth, the manager, had returned, sitting clumsily by a beautiful pillar, his poise showing through his handcuffs. "If I may, Mr. Moore," he said. "You may not," Jordan answered without glancing at him. "Not in this place. Not right now." As though smacked, Gareth swallowed whatever apology he was about to make and turned to face the bar, making a desperate flick of his fingers to indicate the head waiter. Despite its efforts to move on, the room was unable to break free from the tension of the encounter. There was now a stilted edge to conversations. Waiters drifted like ghosts, present yet shaky, and laughter seemed strained. Seated in her proper chair, Alina looked around the room with cool accuracy. She had lived her entire life learning how to look unconcerned in spaces that were meant to keep her out. When people questioned her right to be in a place they had already claimed, she understood what it meant to keep her back straight. However, this one was different. This was neither a publisher's gala nor a university boardroom. There were many individuals in this room who believed that having money allowed them to remove her. And now they were forced to endure the awkwardness of her presence. Jordan chose not to sit. Rather, he stood behind her chair, arms folded loosely, his body straight, and watched as Gareth came again, this time accompanied by 2 security officers in plain black suits. There were enough whispers coming from the corners of the room at the sight of them. Alina narrowed her eyes and said to herself, "You must be kidding." Gareth started again, pretending to have authority that he no longer had. "Mr. Moore, another visitor has requested that we reduce the level of tension. Maybe we should move Dr. Moore to another area of the restaurant." Jordan said, "Let me stop you right there. Since your guest finds it awkward that my wife is seated at her own table, are you recommending that she be moved?" Gareth paused. "Just a hint of courtesy, sir." Something actually snapped at that same moment, not loudly or visibly. With her hands delicately resting on the table's edge, Alina stood slowly and deliberately. When she spoke, her voice was deadly and silent. "To be clear, you believe that removing me is the best course of action after rejecting my reservation, offering me a seat beside the kitchen, giving my table to a person who entered after me, and observing her publicly make fun of me in front of your guests." She glanced back at Gareth after glancing at the 2 security officers. "Do you want me to be pulled out as well? I've survived worse than this velvet-lined circus of fake civility, I assure you." The sound of her words reverberated, piercing the atmosphere like smoke on silk. Uncertain of whose side he was supposed to be on, one of the guards shuffled uneasily. Gareth went white. "Please understand, Dr. Moore." "No," Jordan answered, moving to stand next to her. "You get it. You and I are no longer communicating as manager and investor as of right now. As 2 men on opposing sides of a litigation, we are communicating with an electromagnetic buzz that seemed to reverberate throughout the room. The word lawsuit seemed to ring off the crystal glasses. Now, a number of heads turned freely. A fork was dropped at the next table. Gareth stepped back completely, his expression shifting from one of fright to one of calculating. "This is not required," Jordan yelled. "It became necessary the moment you tried to erase. Agree when your prejudice became corporate policy, the moment this entire establishment decided that whiteness was the most important factor and that everyone else should take a seat close to the kitchen." No one talked or reached for their beverages as the silence returned, this time tinged with regret. Even Veronica, who was now seated 2 tables away, remained still, her gaze turned aside and her jaw clenched. Alina inhaled slowly and steadily, as though she were recovering every oxygen molecule the chamber had attempted to take away from her. She didn't want to cry, because now was not the time to cry, not because she felt weak. This was a time to face reality. She sat down once more, but this time she was in a position of complete clarity rather than just a chair. No one needed to apologize to her. She required responsibility. Jordan put a gentle hand on her shoulder, showing camaraderie rather than consolation. He then turned to face Gareth, who appeared to be trying to blend into the carpet. Jordan said, "You have an hour. Make time in your schedule." He hesitated and said, "We're calling an emergency meeting with the board. Additionally, avoid touching the reservation log at all costs. We have a copy already." He then sat next to his wife, whose very presence now served as a declaration. Everyone in the room let out a collective sigh. But nobody went back to their usual behavior, since they realized that this was more than simply a table. It wasn't power and who gets to choose who should be seated outside of Vivre Blanc's opulent facade were at issue here. The valet line was covered in lengthy shadows from the late afternoon sun, which transformed expensive cars into sleek outlines in the golden light. Inside, the scent of freshly uncorked champagne and a hint of lavender from the next courtyard filled the air. The eatery resembled a stronghold of seclusion, glass, stone, and quiet. No one inside was aware that something was already changing, just outside the doors. This is the kind of change that is announced with precision, inevitability, and the quiet buzz of invention wrapped in luxury rather than with sirens or fanfare. When a Tesla Roadster, black and shiny like a predator in the sun, turned the corner and slid into the exclusive drop-off lane, the sound was a low, whispering hum. True power loves to operate in a quiet, purposeful manner, no horns, no revs. With clipboard in hand, the valet moved forward on autopilot, but halted when he noticed who had left. With a poise that verged on royalty, Jordan Moore, dressed in a custom-tailored three-piece navy suit, stepped out of the driver's seat. He took his time and didn't look about like a man who wasn't confident of himself. He just stood up straight. The smooth leather soles of his jacket whispered against the stone as he strode forward, his fingertips flicking the sleeves to lock the automobile. The valet nodded tightly, almost bowing. Jordan failed to recognize him. He was already focused on the doorway and what was on the other side. 20 minutes prior, he had received a single sentence from Alina via text. "They gave my seat to someone else, and I'm standing at the door." He didn't have to respond, so he didn't. The response was his presence. The air inside changed like a barometer before a storm as Jordan stepped through the door. Glasses clinked hesitantly as conversations halted. A faint undercurrent of uneasiness pierced the air-conditioned silence as the personnel froze. Jordan strolled by the main bar, past the hostess stand where Amber stood still, and past Gareth, who had returned from a corridor with a blush rising from his collar, all without making eye contact. None of them were visible to him. There was just one thing he could see. With the window draped in wisteria behind her, Alina remained sitting at table 3, her dignity unwavering, her face composed, and her chin high. The stillness had been there for a long time, but he arrived to her in less than 10 seconds. During those moments, rumors started to draft themselves into reality, inquiries were spoken under breath, and names were murmured. Without being theatrical or ostentatious, Jordan leaned in, put his hand on Alina's shoulder, and planted a purposeful kiss on the top of her head. The room gasped as she responded by reaching up and touching his wrist, her fingers lingering. Then, like a general surveying a battleground he had not selected but would undoubtedly complete, Jordan turned and rose slowly. "Gareth Simmons is which one?" With a deep voice that sliced through the silence like a blade, he asked. Having crouched behind a marble column, Gareth was forced to move forward and clear his throat. "Mr. Moore, my name is Gareth." Jordan's face remained unchanged. "You're the one that chose to make fun of my wife in front of a group of people, I see." Hands gripping behind his back like a schoolboy caught, Gareth hesitated. "Tell a lie. I promise there has been some confusion, Mr. Moore. When her name appeared in the reservation book, was there any confusion?" Jordan paused, raising one eyebrow. "Or did you only become confused when a white socialite entered and you thought she looked more suitable for the table? The word appropriate, which dared someone to wince, hung in the air like a sword. Nobody did." Gareth swallowed after attempting to speak. Finally, faintly, he added, "I didn't realize she was your wife." Jordan's voice rose suddenly, not in volume but in resonance. And he replied, "You didn't need to realize anything. You only needed to respect the customer, keep the reservation, and refrain from making assumptions about women based on things like whether or not they have designer logos on their heels or jewels around their necks." Now, the silence was oppressive as well as uncomfortable. Individuals were perspiring into their suits. One table away, Veronica Langley had become motionless, her glass of rosé unopened. Jordan's eyes skimmed over her, and she turned away. "Additionally, you sat at a table with another woman's name on it, knowing full well that it wasn't yours," he remarked, speaking directly to her. Invoking her characteristic smugness, Veronica lifted her chin. "I was unaware of the specifics. I was seated by the staff." Jordan retorted that the staff follows the mood of the room, which was established by your entitlement. He looked back at Gareth. "In addition to embarrassing my wife, you have also damaged this brand, my name, and my investment." She entered with grace rather than haughtiness, which made you believe she was invisible. Your authority is now the only thing that is unseen. Gareth's mouth parted, then shut again. Beside him, a man who may have been another manager started to advance. Jordan, however, held up one hand. "Give up. We will not dismiss this as a small annoyance. This was a public erasing, a decision to put looks over morality." He lowered his voice like a rumbling thunderclap. "But allow me to enlighten you if you believe this to be merely a social disgrace." He took his phone out of his pocket, gave it a single tap, and raised it. "This is digital evidence that Table 3 was booked under Alina Moore," he added, rotating the screen to display the reservation confirmation in strong black writing. "Verified via your system, time-stamped, confirmed. You must give her a reckoning, not just an apology." There was no need to elaborate on the statement. It echoed in the wine glasses, rebounded off the ceiling, and pumped through the marble floor and up through the glossy glass. People were unsure about whether to lean in or turn away. Trying to maintain her composure, Veronica got up and walked away from her table without saying anything, but everyone could see that she was trembling. The hands... Slowly, Gareth took a step back, nodding as though he had just remembered how... He murmured, "Of course." "We'll fix this." Jordan stepped forward and said, "No, Gareth, I'll make this right. However, you should get ready to tell the board why you might not be able to run this business in the future." Then he turned, sat down next to Alina, and let out a last breath. Its owner had left a crater in the room, where silence had once been seen as weakness, even if the Tesla had arrived without a roar. Jordan took his seat, but the tension in Vivre Blanc remained. It became thicker. It shadowed every silver fork raised to quivering lips, clung to the walls, and crept into talks like an unbreakable storm. All of the guests' attempts to return to the pace of luxury, including ordering additional glasses of wine and whispering about charity and business galas, fell flat. They were witnessing something they had rarely seen before, a system that was breaking apart, politeness being dismantled by power, and Gareth Simmons, the manager who used to control the floor with slick looks and carefully manicured charisma, now appearing to be a man strolling barefoot across glass. With table 3 regained, redefined, and exuding a dignity no chandelier could match, he hovered at the edge of the dining room, feigning to answer calls on his headset as his gaze darted to the corner where Jordan and Alina now sat. Jordan was silent for a few minutes. He only sipped the quiet water in front of him, his hand casually lying on the table, while Alina sat motionless next to him, her eyes serene but blazing with something more profound. Not rage. No, something more invasive. Accuracy. Recall. A silent rage that recalled all the breaths Gareth had robbed her of. Jordan put down his glass. Without looking, he said, "We need the reservation log." Alina raised her head. "They'll claim it was overwritten or erased, you know." He gave a nod. "I made sure the IT department sent me all internal revisions and cloud syncs from this morning. Because of this, every 30 minutes, the system automatically archives." His words cut through the tension like piano wire, but his voice didn't soar. "I would like to know exactly whose name was changed, as well as when." Then Gareth came, pale and hesitant. The sneer had vanished, replaced by the quiver of a guy who had just understood that he had not earned his position. "It was passed on via closeness and conceit. I'm certain that we can resolve this without things getting worse, Mr. Moore. As I have stated, this was an unfortunate oversight that did not represent our principles." Jordan slowly turned. "Gareth, what are your values?" The manager blinked. "Sir?" "Your values," Jordan reiterated. "Does your hiring manual have a list of them somewhere? Or is selective hospitality the only way they are practiced, like a malfunctioning hinge?" Gareth's mouth opened and closed. "We don't normally work like this." "But that's the way you always do things," Alina interrupted, her voice piercing. "I have heard complaints concerning Vivre Blanc before. I simply never imagined that I would be one of them." Jordan took a folded piece of paper out of his jacket's inside pocket before Gareth could object. Slowly, as if he had endless time, he opened it. "This is the automatically generated edit log for today's reservations," he added, laying it flat on the table. "Table Moralina, 3:01 p.m. was in the original file." Jordan checked and saw that the entry had been changed to Langley Veronica at 2:48 p.m. "So tell me, how did it happen, Gareth?" As if it were written in a language he didn't understand, Gareth gazed at the paper. "I don't remember changing that." With her gaze fixed on him, Alina answered, "Of course not." Gareth swallowed hard, because remembering meant accepting responsibility. Jordan interrupted to suggest that the hostess, Amber, might not have administrator access. VIP reservations can only be overridden by management. The ramifications landed on Gareth's lapels like ash. His posture was drooping under the weight of the repercussions he never thought would befall him, and the man was unraveling, strand by strand. Gareth murmured feebly, "Perhaps I misinterpreted the instruction or assumed the reservation was provisional." Jordan responded, tapping the page, "There's a confirmation number, time-stamped, sent straight from your system to my assistant, who then passed it along to Alina." Alina leaned a little closer and spoke in a quiet but deadly tone. "How exhausting is it to struggle for space that you have already earned, to be informed that you don't belong in rooms that you helped construct?" Gareth remained silent. He was unable to. In itself, his silence was a confession. The impact of the altercation had spread throughout the room. Customers were stealing pictures while feigning to browse through emails on their phones. He gave a stern nod when a woman whispered in his ear. The shame was no longer private. A public reckoning was held, and despite its meticulously manicured perfection, Vivre Blanc was starting to resemble a broken, elegant mirror beneath the exterior. Jordan calmly grabbed for his phone once more and tapped a button after folding the reservation log and putting it back in his jacket. Rachel, the restaurant's assistant general manager, showed up next to their table a moment later. She was a timid woman with dark-rimmed spectacles. "Simply notify the board that I'm calling an emergency session for 7:30 p.m., Jordan said to Rachel. "Mr. Simmons and all other senior staff members must be present." Rachel's gaze shifted from Gareth to Jordan. "Indeed, sir," he went on to say, "I want the entire week's reservation log audited in the interim. Any changes? Are there any deletions? Are there any names that are repeated or that were inexplicably moved?" Jordan held up a finger before Gareth could open his mouth again. "Don't talk. Simply get ready." Gareth took a step back, like a man backing away, a precipice. Although his departure was silent, it was just as dramatic as a scene from a courtroom play. He had anticipated being the host for the day. He was now a liability right in his own home. Alina eventually let out a breath as the manager vanished behind a glass partition, not one of relief or triumph, but one of grounding. She looked at Jordan, who was sitting next to her, his face impassive, one arm slung across the back of her chair. "She said you didn't have to come." He looked around. "You ought not to have." It was necessary to stand, and there was the distinction. Jordan did not elevate Alina in a society that measured her by conditions and margins. He knew who she was. There was no question of her value. It was true. What about that table? Food had never been the topic. The location had been the focus, about getting noticed, about being tallied. The eatery would now have to pay for its mistake. A young, obviously anxious waiter walked up to the yaw and, without saying anything, placed down 2 new glasses of wine. He avoided looking into their eyes. He did, however, covertly drop a folded napkin on the table's corner before turning away. Slowly, Alina unlocked it. 4 words that spoke for themselves were inscribed inside in looping pen strokes. "You weren't the initial one." Over her shoulder, Jordan read it. He did not recoil. "Then," he said, "it's time to make sure you're the last." A completely other type of gathering was occurring behind a frosted glass door, at the end of a tiny corridor marked "Staff Only" at precisely 7:30 p.m., while the final meal was being served to the unaware elite still lingering in the dining hall of Vivre Blanc. It led to the private boardroom, which is rarely utilized and is always immaculate. Power brokers use it to discuss numbers over espresso and avoid criticism. But the only thing on the menu tonight was judgment. The space itself was icy exquisite, with high-backed leather chairs surrounding a table of polished obsidian, a hidden projector set into the ceiling, and an integrated wine bar that no one dared to enter. This was not a meeting over supper. It was a reckoning. With hands clasped and a calm posture that only men with absolute leverage could afford, Jordan sat at the head of the table. The room did not contain Alina. She no longer had to wage this war. They'd already fought it. Jordan had to win this fight now. 6 executives and stakeholders sat across from him in fitted suits. Some had silver hair, some were too well dressed to be seasoned, but they were all a little uneasy about what they could sense was coming. Last to enter was Gareth Simmons. Holding a leather portfolio he hadn't opened all evening, he walked into his funeral like a man. Jordan played a subtle power move by leaving his seat curiously unassigned, allowing the omission to linger like a dare. One of the partners gave Gareth a sidelong glance as he cleared his throat and sat down in the farthest vacant chair without being asked. The tension was instantaneous, deliberate, and nearly strategic. Jordan was the first to speak. I want to make it clear before we start that this emergency meeting has been convened in accordance with Clause 12 of the Operating Charter, which states that gross misconduct necessitates executive review. Even though he spoke calmly, each syllable had a sharp edge. We'll discuss what the paper doesn't mention tonight, even though you've all read the reports. A senior board member steepled his fingers and leaned forward. Jordan, I acknowledge that the circumstance was regrettable, but do we really think this calls for such a drastic reaction? We've had Gareth since the beginning. He contributed to the creation of the Vivre Blanc experience. With a slight smile pulling at the corner of his mouth, Jordan cocked his head. What is the Vivre Blanc experience exactly? Is it about creating a welcoming atmosphere for the appropriate type of people, or is it about foie gras and ambiance? There was no unanimity in the hush that followed that query. It was a fear of what Jordan might already know, of the answer, and of involvement. Another participant cleared her throat. She was younger and more tech-savvy. The reservation logs have been shown to us. There is an obvious override. However, how can we demonstrate intent? The black touchpad in front of Jordan had a button that he tapped. With a quiet, mechanical hum, the projector came down and the lights faded. He asserted that a signature on a document does not always indicate intent. Occasionally, there is a pattern. Behind him, a screen came to life, revealing a spreadsheet that was damning, time-stamped, and color-coded. Minority guests were either moved, delayed, or inexplicably absent from the system 17 times in the last 6 months. 12 of those had their reservation tables redistributed to last-minute white arrivals. During the period of the modification, Gareth had override access in all 17 situations. The evidence was indisputable. Quiet, tidy, and cold. The faces around the table, however, started to form a storm in that silence. A single man shuffled uneasily. Another reclined in his seat as if backing off would somehow keep him safe. Gareth's mouth moved. With all due respect, you're making a lot of assumptions, he responded firmly. Dozens of reasons exist. Jordan interrupted. VIPs, high-profile guests, and special requests to make a reservation do not justify systemic bias. Even though his voice was level, it now had a noticeable edge. This is about more than one visitor. This has to do with the culture you promoted, where politeness is valued and discrimination is the norm. His gaze returned to the board. Let's not act as though your bottom line is unaffected by this. All of those displaced visitors cut back on their spending, departed early, and in some cases never came back. You're not merely immoral. You're not productive. There was a flicker, a fire behind Gareth's eyes, a desperate struggle for balance despite his thin face. You've hardly showed yourself around here. And you think you can lecture me about efficiency while we handle the daily chaos? You hide behind ownership. You have no idea what it takes to keep up such a high-end brand. The space became rigid. It crackled in the air. Jordan's smile vanished as he leaned forward with his elbows resting on the table. You're correct. How you uphold elitism by removing a professor's name from a reservation list is beyond me. Or how does complexion, in your opinion, define class? However, I'm aware of leverage. Additionally, I submitted a motion with our legal team 30 minutes ago to start the process of terminating you for violating ethical standards. Like wind through parched leaves, a collective exhale blew through the boardroom. Gareth stood up suddenly, his voice trembling and his fists clenched. I made one decision under pressure, and you're going to discard 10 years of loyalty because of it. Jordan was 2 feet taller, more stable, and surprisingly much colder. I'm not discarding anything. I'm doing some housework. He produced a hefty, signed and stapled document. This is your formal notice. We've taken away your access. HR will arrange for your departure. And before contacting any Vivre Blanc employees again, I advise you to consult your own legal counsel. Gareth scanned the table, but nobody looked him in the eye. His power was gone. He wasn't just let go. The very silence he had once employed as a weapon wiped him out. The boardroom door clicked behind Gareth as he ran out. Jordan turned back to the others, treating him as if he had reached a definite decision. From here, we rebuild accountability, equity, and openness. It's not a choice. It is this brand's future. At last, an older board member gave a nod. I agree. In addition, it's long overdue. It's brave, but essential. Jordan didn't grin. With calm eyes, he just sat back down. Then tonight we begin, unaware that the restaurant they believed they knew had already started to burn, and that something completely different would emerge from its ashes. The hum of luxury and laughing continued outside the room. The headlines came in like a swarm the morning following the boardroom purge. Quick, unrelenting, and unavoidable. Exclusive. An internal controversy rocked Vivre Blanc. The reservation system's racial prejudice was revealed. Someone inside, who had probably filmed portions of the board meeting, was responsible for the article's release before daybreak. Who didn't matter, did they? The fact that the truth was no longer kept secret was what counted. It had overflowed into the public sphere. And now the very individuals who had once lauded Vivre Blanc were tearing apart its meticulously manicured image, which had formerly been associated with luxury and fine taste. Jordan didn't panic when the press leak occurred, but he hadn't prepared for it either. He was glad of it. What Gareth and his quiet enablers had attempted to conceal with civility and scent was now unquestionable, and truth becomes unmanageable when it is unquestionable. 5 significant influencers who had mentioned the restaurant on social media in the previous 12 hours apologized for endorsing a place that was founded on silent exclusion. Instead of furious tirades, the Yelp page was overflowing with personal narratives, some serene, some heartbreaking, all bound together by a common theme. One person commented, "My father sat down near the kitchen even though he was wearing his best suit." Another said, "I always assumed it was just bad luck. I now see it wasn't." Alina's comment was much worse for the board. She was named as a visiting ethics lecturer on her university's blog, and it was uploaded without much fanfare at midday. Just a strong, straightforward statement, no drama. When you have to battle to be recognized in a facility you helped fund, you realize that silence is never neutral and that exclusion can take many forms. Within an hour, the quote was shared more than 10,000 times. From his penthouse office, Jordan watched it unfold, staring out over a skyline that seemed suddenly smaller than it had been before. His chief of staff, Lisa, came in with her iPad in one hand and her jaw clenched. "A name? The mayor's office just called us," she said. "In an apparent attempt to limit the political ramifications, they are asking for a meeting." With a nod, Jordan scheduled it for Friday. 3 workers from other upscale restaurants have also come forward, she added. What took place at Vivre Blanc is referred to as the invisible velvet rope, since it is not an isolated instance. Discrimination that is discreet but concealed. Jordan took a while to reply. He got up, went to the window, and peered down at the street below, where tourists, taxis and Teslas drove by under posters announcing the city's dedication to inclusivity. He was aware of the irony. He said, "Tell them I want names. We track down the network if it's systemic." By 3 o'clock, a group of business people announced a task force tasked with checking upmarket restaurants for bias, incident logs, reservation patterns, and service behavior. The first tile to tilt was Vivre Blanc, who had turned into the catalyst. Now, however, the strain was trembling an entire industry. Richard Langley, the patriarch of the Langley estate and Veronica's uncle, called Jordan at 5:45 p.m. Veronica hadn't been seen in public since the evening she was kicked out of table 3. With a silky yet acerbic voice, Langley stated, "You've made your point. You have disgraced decent individuals and reputable companies. Before this becomes an outrage, let's discuss reducing the intensity. It is a crusade," was Jordan's succinct response before he hung up. Meanwhile, another sort of change was taking place within Vivre Blanc itself. The employees had been summoned to a private conference. There were no suits, no clients, only the truth. Jordan stood in the middle of the deserted dining room, with the tables bare and the lights down to a low, personal setting. Many of the staff members who had been silent, including servers, hosts, kitchen workers, and housekeeping crews, assembled, years of witnesses. Jordan started by saying, "Some of you have seen what's been happening. While some of you survived it, others benefited by remaining silent." He took a moment to process the reality. If someone was afraid for their job, I'm not here to punish them. However, today marks the end of this place's culture. You should no longer report to those who value appearance over honesty. You answer to leaders who understand what it's like to be both overqualified and neglected. Isaiah Tachter, a young black server, held out his hand. "Is it safe for us to speak now? On 2 occasions, I was passed over for a promotion. When I first protested, I was put on closing shifts for 3 months in a row." Jordan gave him a direct look. "You're safe, Doris, and you've been promoted thus far. Head of guest relations, starting right now, like a balloon untied." The room let forth a breath. One hand was raised, then another. Stories were pouring out, some harsh, some whispered, all genuine. For a staff that had been barely surviving, it was more than simply a meeting. It was a confessional. They were also being believed for the first time, not merely heard. Jordan implemented a formal policy across all of his endeavors before the end of the week. AI-assisted reservation tracking to keep an eye out for bias trends, anonymous internal reporting platforms, and training that emphasizes equity under the supervision of ethics boards and other parties. It was referred to as radical by the media. Rivals referred to it as risky. Customers, however, made the correct call. Then, perhaps most startling of all, Veronica herself called. She didn't start by apologizing. Her leadership was calculated. "My family wants to put an end to this. We'll make a donation. We'll openly back your reforms. If necessary, we will even withdraw our silent deposits. Stop degrading our name, please." After listening, Jordan answered, "Your name is being exposed, not dragged. Perhaps it's time for folks to see the true meaning of the grin." She didn't answer. She just hung up. It made little difference, though, because the dominoes were now falling more quickly. As reports emerged from staff members who had been influenced by the repercussions at Vivre Blanc, other industries, including fashion, technology, and publishing, started to face their consequences. Ever the scholar, Alina received an invitation to present at a conference on global ethics. She turned down the podium. Table 3, a case study on silent power and the geography of disrespect, was the title of the paper she instead submitted. It was approved in a matter of hours. Jordan recognized that the story was now bigger than them. It wasn't just a restaurant he'd interrupted. He had broken into a system. He also realized that all revolutions start with opposition, even though the path ahead would be paved with it. One individual refused to remain silent beside the kitchen after being told they didn't belong. After a week, Vivre Blanc had begun to bloom once more, with the wisteria hanging outside. This time, however, it seemed more like a witness to change than a background for prosperity. The signs for the restaurant were still there. But there was a subtle but permanent change in the atmosphere. The fake grins and cold looks of exclusion that formerly greeted only the appropriate kind of people were no more. Something much more subdued but far more potent took its place. Consciousness, accountability, and a brittle hope being meticulously put together like linen and crystalware. A black SUV with tinted windows drove to the curb that Friday night as the sun poured molten gold across the gleaming pavement. Not a single valet came forward. No flashbulbs exploded. However, the seriousness of the situation was evident to all who witnessed it. Dr. Alina Moore had come back to eat, not to argue or confront. Wearing ivory silk, she went out with her curls falling down her shoulders and her complexion shimmering warmly bronze in the sunlight. She didn't command the space with brands, bold jewelry, or a dramatic red lip. None of it was necessary for her. The command was her presence. Jordan, dressed in a slate-grey suit, stepped out of the SUV next to her, his hand instinctively slipping into hers as they made their way to the doors. With reverence, the doors that had previously framed her shame opened. Just inside, waiting, was Isaiah, head of guest relations, the man who had inquired as to whether it was safe to speak, now wearing a stylish black blazer embroidered with the restaurant's emblem. Now, his smile was genuine rather than meek or overdone. "Dr. Moore," Isaiah said in a calm but dignified tone. "Welcome back to Vivre Blanc, Mr. Moore. Your table is prepared." Alina's head cocked slightly. "Isaiah, thank you." She didn't exaggerate it. She didn't have to. As she entered, every eye in the foyer followed her, not out of interest this time, but out of deference. Like a tidal regaining its shores, the staff straightened their posture, talks became softer, and the force of her homecoming filled the room. No one stopped her and Jordan as they passed through the main hall. Nobody attempted to interrupt with forced grins or hollow excuses. A new bouquet of white peonies and soothing candlelight framed the empty table by the window, the notorious Table 3, which was clad in white linen. However, it was no longer merely a table. It served as a scar, a chapter, and a symbol. A pledge. Jordan's hand brushed the back of hers as she sat, and Isaiah pulled out her chair. "You take the lead this time," Jordan whispered softly as he sat down across from her. She gave a little smile, one of introspection rather than triumph. "Let's check if everyone in the room is prepared to listen." A young woman called Natalie, who had been working at the restaurant for a little more than a year, came up to them as their server. Although she was obviously apprehensive as she moved, the tone of her voice had changed. "It's a privilege to serve you both," she remarked, carefully setting the menus down. "I was instructed to inform you by Chef Amari. Women who take charge without raising their voices are the inspiration behind tonight's cuisine." The corners of her mouth lifted as Alina's brows went up. "That's quite a theme," Natalie said, blushing before nodding. "You'd understand," he said. For the first time, Alina felt at ease as the city pulsed softly under the dusk outside the big windows. This was not because justice had been fully served, but rather because she had been seen, heard, and given what she wanted back. She could feel the change in the room's focus all around her. Nobody was staring at her incredulously or perplexedly. Why she was here was not a mystery to them. Now they were aware. Furthermore, they were wondering why they had never questioned themselves in the same way. Respectfully, a couple at the adjacent table nodded. "Thank you," a woman at the bar mouthed, not for show or drama, but for a narrative that gave voice to all the quiet exclusion they had experienced behind glass, silk, and so-called sophistication. Alina leaned into the conversation with Jordan when their lunch arrived, which included dishes named after revolutionary women from different continents. But she was unable to deny the feelings that were rushing beneath her calm. She relived that first day in her head, standing in a white frock, being tossed aside, having her name removed, and having her dignity traded away for the comfort of another. The woman, name, and elegance had all changed, but she was no longer someone they could remove without facing repercussions. This was reclamation, not retaliation, and reclamation required presence to endure rather than rage to burn. Isaiah returned halfway through the meal, this time carrying a small black packet instead of wine. He placed it carefully on the table and remarked, "We had this framed, believed it should be yours. It contained a time-stamped, preserved, and now glass-mounted printout of the original reservation confirmation from that fateful day." After staring at it for a while, Alina carefully put down her fork, picked up the frame, and grinned softly and slowly. "Proof that history has a receipt sometimes," she added quietly. Jordan raised his glass and laughed. He pointed to the table. "Every single one that will never be taken away from someone because they don't fit the room, not just this one." The toast reverberated well beyond their table, but they clinked glasses. It was a declaration as well as a celebration. A new work, a black-and-white photograph of a lady sitting in profile at a restaurant table, her face directed toward the light, her posture unbending, was displayed on the wall behind them that had previously held portraits of French vineyards. Table 3, where elegance redefined the rules, was written on the plaque underneath it. Employees discussed it in whispers, visitors inquired about the woman's identity, and the proprietors remained silent. The room already knew, so they didn't have to. The check came in a gold-trimmed envelope with a note instead of the sum printed on it. "Thank you on behalf of all future visitors who will never again be told they don't belong." Jordan put it away without saying anything. The chamber automatically straightened as Alina stood slowly and elegantly, and guests turned in admiration rather than terror. Shamefully, she left through the same doors that had previously signaled her departure, but the breeze was different this time. Her story, inscribed on the bones of a table that had previously been rejected, was now the story of an empire that had been permanently altered. The city felt warmer, and the flowers seemed fuller, because history doesn't always take place in capital cities or courtrooms. It occasionally takes place during dinner. A breeze blew through the city the next Monday, like the discharge of something long and oppressive, finally uprooted. Vivre Blanc opened its doors with a new rhythm that judged integrity by action rather than merely reciting French specials or shining cutlery. Every reservation was encrypted, every seating change was recorded, time-stamped and transparent. And the reservation desk was now behind a digital kiosk that was directly connected to a cloud-based verification system. Previously assigned to silently enforce invisible limits, the hostess now functioned with clarity. Her name was Maya, and she wore a crown of her own natural curls. She had previously been instructed to dress softer, smile more, and change her code to fit the customer. But today, she was wearing a navy blazer with a gold logo that said, "Equity is the new luxury." The arrangement inside has also changed, though not significantly. The floor plan is now focused on visibility. There are no longer any hidden tables by the service doors, but no walls have been relocated. The lighting was set up to feel cozy rather than elite. The menu had been revised to reflect acknowledgement as well as taste. There was a note in each part. The cultures whose cuisine influenced the world, but whose names were all too frequently omitted from the reservation list, served as the inspiration for this meal. It was audacious and calculated, because discomfort was no longer a phobia for Vivre Blanc. It accepted it, made room for it, and, above all, the individuals coming back were not the ones who had previously controlled the area by entitlement. They were the ones who had long shunned it, and suddenly stepped in as patrons rather than exceptions. Change has spread much farther behind the scenes. Blind screenings and community outreach were used to examine and modify the restaurant's hiring policy, which had previously been ambiguous and favoring fit. After being formally elevated to Director of Guest Experience, Isaiah established weekly staff dialogues as a forum for complaints, thoughts, and suggestions. Jordan Moore was at the top of it all, not as a silent investor anymore, but as the creator of a new benchmark. He was not a micromanager. He maintained visibility and accountability, surrounded himself with voices that were distinct from his own, and led with clarity. In the hospitality industry, his reputation had started to circulate as a disruptor as well as a mogul. No one could ignore him, but not everyone agreed. There was a hushed cheer when Alina returned to college. Once admiring her from afar, students now stopped her in the hallways to say things like, I saw the article, or thank you for speaking when others will not. She gave a polite grin, but she avoided drawing attention to herself because she had never wanted to represent a movement. She had just refused to disappear. The university changed the title of her guest lecture from Ethics in Emerging Systems to The Geography of Power. Anyhow, whose table is it? The number of attendees tripled. It wasn't until the very end that she mentioned her personal story. It was more than a seat, she remarked. It dealt with how rapidly someone who doesn't fit the unwritten aesthetic of belonging will be displaced by a system. However, we tend to forget that standards change with time. They are selected. We can also pick better ones. And they had, since other dominoes had fallen outside Vivre Blanc's gleaming walls. Following a client's reference to a widely shared video from Alina's interview, a high-end spa in Seattle updated its intake forms. When a jazz lounge in Atlanta received criticism for unfairly rejecting natural hairstyles, it quietly amended its dress rule. Additionally, a high-end hotel in New York that has a track record of overbooking visitors of color covertly added bias detection software to its booking system. No news release. Only a change, only responsibility. Sometimes revolutions happened like that, in form, not in flames. Jordan was standing in Vivre Blanc's now free main dining hall late one evening. The final visitors had left. The gentle amber glow from the muted lights created shadows that resembled stories rather than darkness. Now permanently marked as Dr. Moore's table on the reserve map, he ran a finger over the perimeter of Table 3, not in possession, but in heritage. He didn't require cheers. A plaque on the wall was not what he wanted. He desired a space where everyone was aware that the seat was not a present. It was a privilege. A moment later, Helena came in, her face unreadable, her heels soft on the wood floor. She shifted next to him, listening to the quiet. She whispered, I thought I'd hate coming back here. Instead, Jordan turned to her and said, It feels like I finally own the silence. Not mine, he said. It was rewritten by you. They entered the terrace together, where the distant traffic and distant chatter echoed the heartbeat of the city. With the crisp air and the stars above them blinking like silent witnesses, she leaned against the railing. Is it going to last? She inquired. Jordan remained silent for a while. Some will perform, some will oppose, but enough will remember as it changes. To change the axis, you only need that. A second went by. It began with you, he continued. One woman who refused to back down. One name on a ledger. She grinned for herself, not for him. She stated, I didn't have to win the argument. All I needed was the space to acknowledge my mistake. The employees gathered their things inside. Thank you for creating a room that finally fits me, was written on the counter by the new sous chef, Lin, a Vietnamese woman who had never felt at ease applying to places like this until last week. Alina noticed it through the window. The corner of her mouth twitched slightly, but she remained silent. Jordan took out a new folder from inside his coat. Plans for growth and proposals, as well as demands from 3 other cities to duplicate the Vivre Blanc makeover. "It's beginning," he stated. "The blueprint is sought after." She glanced up at the horizon, then down at the folder. "Then," she said, "give them one. However, make sure kids comprehend that the guts to stand next to the table while being told they don't belong is the benchmark, not the table itself." The city became quieter as the night grew darker. However, a lady and a man stood next to the table that had attempted to delete her, not in triumph or vindication, inside a restaurant that had been rebuilt from tradition, mistake, and fire. Outside of that glass, the world started to set boundaries, not about who belonged, but about what could no longer be accepted, while observing, hearing, and learning. For the standard had altered after that night, and it now included her name. We appreciate your participation in this potent voyage of bravery, dignity, and change. Please leave a comment below if this tale touched you, got you thinking, or brought back memories of something you've gone through or seen. Your voice would be much appreciated. To ensure you don't miss the next story that could transform your perspective on the world, remember to like, subscribe, and activate the notification bell. In the interim, remain courageous, remain kind, and never hesitate to take back your place at the table. I'll see you later.